yatamritam tapta jivanam kaviviridhitam kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvivananti Puriyajana. Om, your words are like nectar, bringing life to scorched souls. They are praised by poets and remove all sin. They are auspicious to hear, wonderful and exalted. Those who spread these words throughout the world are truly giving souls. Welcome, everyone, to our class on Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. I want to start out with a little quick review and just go back to one small, actually big point that I want to elaborate on a little bit more. For those following in the book, we're on page 81. This is the translation by Swami Atmajnanananda, and this is February 1882. And this is Sam's second visit. This is where he asked several questions. And I mentioned earlier that he really covers the entirety of his teachings in a nutshell in the answers he gives to all of these questions. So we can almost say that the entire remaining portion of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is just an extrapolation and expansion commentary on some of the answers that he gives here. And it's very interesting that he will go through, without mentioning it, one by one, all of the different spiritual paths, which we know as the four yogas. It's actually made famous by Swami Vivekananda because of his separate publications on each of the four yogas. So we finished last time with the question that M asked, and humbly, because he wasn't arrogant at all, but he did make a few little suggestions to Sri Ramakrishna and got a little bit of a scolding. And Thakur liked to say, "Oh, you Calcutta people are all the same," giving advice to everybody. So anyhow, he was a little bit humbled, we can say, and he said, "How, sir, yes, sir, how, sir, may we fix our minds on God?" And then we got several answers. Repeat God's name and sing His glories. So he starts out with the Bhakti Yoga, and keep holy company. Now and then visit God's devotees and holy men, which we take to be holy people, men and women. The mind cannot dwell on God if it is immersed day and night in worldliness. In worldly duties and responsibilities, it is most necessary to go into solitude now and then and think of God. So we get chanting the name of the Lord, then we get holy company, then we get solitude. When a tree is young, it should be fenced all around, otherwise it may be destroyed by cattle. Then, to meditate, you should withdraw within yourself or retire to a secluded corner or to the forest. And you should always discriminate between the real and the unreal. God alone is real, the eternal substance. All else is unreal, that is impermanent. By discriminating thus, one should shake off impermanent objects from the mind. Now, I spent a little time, I want to just add a few little points about what Sri Ramakrishna refers to as vichara, because this is something that has a very important role in spiritual practice. And the same term, vichara, that Sri Ramakrishna tells him, he tells him not to do it. So we'll find throughout the gospel that he's telling him, don't reason anymore. So what is the role of reasoning? Vichara, or viveka, discrimination, discernment, being able to separate, like the swan, they say, can separate the milk from the water. It secretes some acid and separates them. So what is the role of reasoning in spiritual life? There's a certain type of reasoning, which we discussed last time. We can say self-enquiry. This self-enquiry is where we ask ourselves, what is the real nature of the self? Who am I? This term, self-enquiry, became very well known because of Ramana Maharshi. This was his main spiritual path. For Sri Ramakrishna, it's one of many different tools that we have to try to analyze what is the real nature of the self. This is extremely important. The other type of discrimination between what will lead me towards God and what will keep me bound to the world. Extremely important. These things are essential in spiritual life. Otherwise, we won't have any real standards to decide what to do and what not to do. So this question of what is the essential goal that I have in life, what is the most important to me, what is most helpful, this is all part of that vichara. There's another side to it with the reasoning where we feel that we can use our understanding and our intellect to reach certain types of philosophical conclusions. And we find that the advantage of this type of vichara is that we run into dead ends. We come up against the wall of time, space, and causation. We've reached the point where we see that we can't really answer all of these ultimate types of questions. We can do the in-between. We can explain how the egg turns into the chicken and the chicken turns into the egg. But if somebody says, well, what was the first one? Then we realize that we're reaching a point where our logic doesn't help us. Now, even the best type of vichara will not take us directly to God. This is the negative role of vichara, which is also very important. When we say negative, it's not to downplay its role. But what we do with the reasoning is we can eliminate everything that is not the self. And then what remains is the self. So it's also a way of, just as with the path of devotion, what are we doing? We're trying to eliminate this self-awareness so that the whole mind is fixed with God, trying to eliminate the ego. And then God alone remains. So it's the same type of thing here. But these other types of questions that we're always asking, and really, if we think about it, how absurd it is to think we can come up with answers to why and how the world was created, and what is the ultimate purpose of these things. It is really absurd to think that from our very limited perspective, with the limited intelligence that we have, that we'll come up with some answer that will satisfy everyone. And this is why the acharyas who came up with the different schools of philosophy could never come up with one system that was so obviously true that it defeated the others. It becomes a different type of point of view. Now, there's a very interesting, I was reminded of this, a very interesting hymn, one of the most beautiful hymns from the Rig Veda. It's called the Nasadiya Suktam. And this is a hymn basically about the beginning of creation. Now, what's interesting is about this is how keenly aware, whoever the author of this was, some inspired Rishi, keenly aware of the limitations of the mind, and not just the human mind, but the fact that these questions don't really have answers. I want to just read the last two verses from this. Well, I'll start in the beginning, first. There was neither existence nor non-existence then. There was neither sky nor heaven beyond it. What covered it and where? What sheltered? Was there any abyss of water? Then it goes on, darkness covered by darkness and everything. But the last two verses. Who knows and who can tell and here tell whence it all came? Whence is this creation? The gods came later to this world, so who knows whence it came? Then we get this beautiful line. Whence this creation came, whether he made it or not. The overseer, he who dwells in the highest heaven, only he knows. And then it says, or perhaps he knows not. So if God himself doesn't know, then we can't really expect to know. So this path of knowledge also doesn't directly take us to the highest realization, because we have to transcend the mind. One of the songs that Sri Ramakrishna liked the most was a song by Ram Prasad, Ke jane kale kamon, shora dorashon e napai dorashon. The darshana, there's a play on words here. Darshana means, here, Shad Darshana is the 6 systems of philosophy, but Darshana also means vision of God. So he's, Ram Prasad, he's saying, who can possibly understand who this Mother Kali is? And then he says that you won't get the vision of Mother Kali through any of the 6 systems of philosophy. So it has to be some direct experience which will transcend the mind. There was a German philosopher, that one of the most famous German philosophers, Immanuel Kant, who wrote a great big book, not a very exciting book, a little bit boring, called The Critique of Pure Reason. And in this, he does a very interesting thing. He'll take some of these absolute questions. Was the world created or not created? Is it eternal? Did it come into existence in time? And he'll take the opposite point of view and show a fallacy. And then he'll do the same thing with the other point of view. And each point of view has a certain fallacy to it. Now, how can that be? It's either A or B. But he says no, that it can't be A and it can't be B. Then he concludes that this is the limit of the human mind. Now, Shankaracharya's Guru's Guru, Gaudapada, he did a similar thing. He concluded that then this universe doesn't exist. Another difficult type of conclusion. Sri Ramakrishna's conclusion is a little bit different. He says, don't bother about it. He said that you've come to the mango to enjoy the mangoes, and you're wasting your time counting the leaves and twigs and everything. His point of view, in many ways, is similar to the Buddhist point of view. The Buddha said that whole life will be spent trying to figure out these things if you're just doing it through your capacity of the mind. So this role of vichara, it can be very positive. So Thakur says it has to be done always. He'll emphasize that, always. This other type, just trying to figure out things through reason, when we really should be doing spiritual practice. This is what he tells them over and over again. Don't do this. Arbichar korona. Then he'll say, promise me. Will you promise me? And then says, yes, I promise you. So this is that role of what he says, always discriminate between the real and the unreal. Now, this also, I mentioned last time, substantial and insubstantial, vastu and avastu, that what is it that really has something within it that can satisfy that longing of the heart. This is something that's substance. If things don't have substance, that means that we're attracted to them. We think that they'll satisfy that emptiness within, and they don't. So this is that other type of discrimination. These things are very important. Okay, so we finished last time with the second question, how ought we to live in the world? Master, do all your duties, but keep your mind on God. Live with all, with wife and children, father and mother, and serve them. Treat them as if they were very dear to you, but know in your heart of hearts that they do not belong to you. Then he gives one of several illustrations. A maidservant in the house of a rich man performs all the household duties, but her thoughts are fixed on her own home in her native village. She brings up her master's children as if they were her own. She even speaks of them as my Rama or my Hari, but in her own mind she knows very well that they do not belong to her at all. This is an attitude that type of guardianship, that we're given responsibility. We're given the privilege of raising a family and looking after them, not that we own them. In order to own something, we have to have a certain type of ego, which is identified with this physical body. This is one thing. And especially with people, we can't own something that has its own independent, separate life. The great mistake, or actually a very natural tendency for parents to think of children as their own, not a possession like a table or a chair or a house or anything, but to not understand that child comes into the world growing up and realizing itself as an independent entity. There's a big difference between relationship between the parents and the child and the parents, because the child has been the child the whole lifetime to the parents. For the child, the parents, they gradually come to realize as they get older that who are these people I'm living with? my mother and father, okay, but they still have some sense that why do they think they can tell me what to do? It's very common for kids to say that. I can figure it out on my own. So the parents have to learn to let go, and the children have to learn to be a little more understanding. But the real point is that if we have this attitude that, yes, I've been given the privilege to raise these children, who do they belong to? They belong to God. They're not really mine, but this is my responsibility and my duty, and I'll do it to the best of my ability. The point that's not mentioned here, which Thakur mentions many times with this example, is that the maidservant has her own home in the village with her own family. That means our real home is in God. And this is something we shouldn't forget. And if we have that type of identification, if I feel that I'm the child of the Divine Mother and not the child of my biological parents, that means I'm not identifying with the body, because it's the body that has the connection, aside from, of course, the psychological and loving connection, but the biological connection ties us to the parents. If my sense of identification is I'm a child of the Divine Mother, then I'm thinking of myself in terms of spirit. So it also changes that with us. Then we'll get some other examples. The tortoise moves about in the water, but can you guess where her thoughts are? There on the bank where her eggs are lying. Do all your duties in the world, but keep your mind on God. If you enter the world without first cultivating love for God, you will be entangled more and more. You will be overwhelmed with its danger, its grief, its sorrows. And the more you think of worldly things, the more you will be attached to them. Then he gives a nice example. First, rub your hands with oil, and then break open the jackfruit. This jackfruit, great big thing. If you go to Jainamati, I remember the first time I saw it at night, I saw this tree. It looked like all these possums were on the branches of them. Great big things with little spiny stuff, big fruit. If you cut it open, it has a milky, sticky, milky type of sap or juice on it that'll stick to your fingers, and it's very hard to get off. So he says if you put a little oil first, then you can cut it open, you can take out, because the little fruit's inside, they can use for cooking, or if it's right for eating, then it won't stick to the hands. So he says first secure the oil of divine love, and then set your hands to the duties of the world. Now we'll go back to solitude. But you must go into solitude to attain this divine love. To get butter from milk, you must let it set into curd in a secluded spot. If it is too much disturbed, milk won't turn into curd. Next, you must put aside all other duties, sit in a quiet spot, and churn the curd. Only then do you get butter. Sri Ramakrishna was very much aware that we go through different stages in life and different stages in spiritual life. One of the problems that we have is kind of an existential problem, that it comes to everyone. It's explained very well in the Kathopanishad that from our very birth, as soon as we're old enough to think, the mind goes outward through the senses. And we have no conception of any inner self at that time. This small child really can't distinguish its own body from its mother's body. There's all different stages that take place. There's some very interesting child psychologists, one Piaget, that I read just little bits and pieces of. He goes through all the different stages of development of the child, and one thing that I always found intriguing is he says when the child learns to tell a lie, this is a sign that the child knows that it has an interior life. that he can think a thought and no one else will know it but him or her. So all different stages, but by the time we develop this ego, because we're not born with the ego the way we think of it. Ego is something that grows and develops. This is why Sri Ramakrishna says that this ego is not anything real. It's part of Maya. It's really just a misconception for most of us. It can be ripe, it can be green, it can be all sorts of things, but the ego that the child first develops is without any conception of an inner life. So there's no chance that a small child will have any sense that I am the self, I am the Atman, anything like that. Now, there are advantages to the child's ego because they don't have the same attachments. That's why Thakur often talks about that, not attached to any of the three gunas. But there's other disadvantages there. Then we become teenagers, and oh my God, the hormones take over. And all reasoning goes out, and we become very body conscious and self-conscious and image conscious and all of these things, so that by the time we hear about spiritual life and want to lead a spiritual life, we've already established this false sense of identification with the body, the mind, the senses, and personality and ego, and our physical appearance, and all sorts of things. So Sri Ramakrishna says that in order to counteract this, the first stage is we have to go into solitude. That doesn't mean so much physically go into solitude, but we have to take some time to quietly analyze things without other people around disturbing us. I mentioned last time this idea that the sense of body consciousness comes from the fact that other people see us as bodies. But I think what's even more important is our sense of self-image is based so much on what other people think of us. And especially, I would say, in the teenage years, that this peer pressure is such a strong thing, that we really, our sense of value and self-worth is based so much on what other people think of us or what we think other people think of us. So there's a real back and forth, that my sense of who I am is based on what I think other people think of me. So we have to really clear the head, go into solitude and think very clearly and very deeply, who is this I that has such strange ideas about who I am and what my self-worth is and self-value and what my goals in life are and what can make me happy, all of these things. We go into solitude first and get a very good understanding. So the first understanding is that we've got everything wrong. One of my favorite sections of the Gospel, M is asked by Sri Ramakrishna if he's understood something. And M says that the one thing that I understand very clearly now is that I don't really understand anything. Is that now I see that I've had a false understanding of things. So this is extremely important. We get this through self-analysis. We have to really examine our priorities. We have to examine our preconceived notions of what's real and what's unreal, what's important and what's not important. Then we can start with some type of spiritual practice. So this first thing, to get butter for milk, let it set into curd in a secluded spot. So this we have to make the mind very still and quiet. If it's disturbed too much, the milk will turn into curd. So that means we don't let outside influences disturb us too much. Only then do you get butter. So he says further, by meditating on God in solitude, the mind acquires knowledge, dispassion, and devotion. Okay, so we get some sense. Knowledge doesn't mean any type of scholarly, academic knowledge, of course. It means we get some sense of who we are and what exactly we want out of life. Very often we ask these questions when it's, I don't want to say too late, but when we should have asked them earlier. That if we know at a young age, and remember, M is still in his, what is he, 26 or something, 28, something like that, when he first goes. He's still a young man. And most of the time Sri Ramakrishna is speaking, he's speaking to young men. Now, I have a feeling that most of the time he's speaking to young men that he thinks will become monks, even though very often there are people of all ages, sometimes older people also in the room. Sometimes he'll speak to them directly, but when he speaks in general, this seems to be his targeted audience. And we have to remember, I'll get into it in a little bit also, maybe not this time. Yeah, I think so. That during Sri Ramakrishna's lifetime, and for whatever reason, some people will say because of Mughal influence all of those years, for whatever reason, the society was pretty much separated, where men and women had their separate areas that, what is called zenana, in the Muslim tradition, that the women had to be kept inside the inner apartments. We'll hear references to that, inner apartments. It wasn't very strong in South India, but in Calcutta it was especially strong, and even throughout Bengal. So whenever Sri Ramakrishna is talking, he's talking to all men. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't talk to women. That I think it was Yoganma, either Yoganma or Golabma. One of them said, "We laugh when we hear that Thakur didn't talk to women. How many times he came and spent so much time with us." And whenever he would go to a devotee's house, say Balaram Bose's house or somebody else's house, generally he would go into what they call the inner apartments. And very often he would eat there, and he would spend time with the women of the household. So at that time we have no recording of what he said, because M wouldn't be present at that time. So everything we have in the Gospel is recorded by M, who was there only when Sri Ramakrishna is talking to men. This is important. Otherwise, and it'll get worse when we get to Kamini Kanchan, otherwise we get this picture of Sri Ramakrishna as only caring about men devotees, but that's only because he's only talking to them at that time. So, further, by meditating on God in solitude, the mind acquires knowledge, dispassion, and devotion. But the very same mind goes downward if it dwells in the world. Okay, now we're going to get into trouble. In the world there is only one thought, and I'm going to read it as it's written here, woman and gold. Now, I was told by Swami Swahanandaji that whenever you see woman and gold, say lust and gold. So I do that generally. This is generally my practice. I follow that. But since it's written that way here, and there's a long footnote, and it really it deserves consideration, because it's a very, very unfortunate phrase to be published now in a book that's equally valuable for men and women. And this Kamini Kanchan was the phrase that he used. Even all of the direct disciples, Swamiji himself, they used the term Kama Kanchani. So they themselves changed it. But let me read the long footnote here, because it really bothers me terribly when I think if women devotees read this for the first time, I wonder how many of them get turned off instantly and don't read any further. So it's important that we understand a little cultural history behind all of this. So this is Swami Nikhilananda's footnote. He says, the term woman in gold, Kamini and Kanchan, which has been used throughout in a collective sense, occurs again and again in the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna to designate the chief impediments to spiritual progress. There's lust and greed. This favorite expression of the master, Kamini Kanchan, has often been misconstrued. By it, he meant only lust and greed, the baneful influence of which retards the aspirant's spiritual growth. He used the word kamini, or woman, as a concrete term for the sex instinct when addressing his men devotees. He advised women, on the other hand, to shun man. Kanchan, or gold, symbolizes greed, which is the other obstacle to spiritual life. Sri Ramakrishna never taught his disciples to hate any woman or womankind in general. This can be seen clearly by going through all his teachings under the head and judging them collectively. The Master looked on all women as so many images of the Divine Mother of the universe. He paid the highest homage to womankind by accepting a woman as his guide while practicing the very profound spiritual disciplines of Tantra. This was the Bhairavi Brahmani, that he had so much tremendous love and respect for her, and she was very important in his spiritual life. His wife, known and revered as the Holy Mother, was his constant companion and first disciple. At the end of his spiritual practice, he literally worshipped his wife as the embodiment of the goddess Kali, the Divine Mother. After his passing away, the Holy Mother became the spiritual guide not only of a large number of householders, but also of many monastic members of the Ramakrishna order. Now, this term kamini, I know a little bit about this because I had to write something on it once, a rebuttal to something that somebody wrote. So I did a little research, and I even wrote to one professor at the University of Chicago. University of Chicago was famous for Bengali studies, one Edmund Dimmick, whom I had met many, many years earlier. And he said it was his understanding, he couldn't trace it back, but this was probably not original with Sri Ramakrishna. This was probably a phrase that was used at the time, kamini kanchan. So this is number one. Number two, the word kami is the masculine form. It means a lustful person. The word kamini should mean a lustful woman, but it doesn't. This is not derogatory towards women, this term kamini. In fact, many of the songs that we read in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna use this term kamini to designate the Divine Mother. Who is that beautiful woman standing in the battlefield? We'll see it many times. And it's not an uncommon name. Girish Ghosh's second wife was named Kailash Kamini. So generally it's the consort of Shiva, the Divine Mother, that way. And if anything, I think it shows a little bit that Sri Ramakrishna was a bit of a feminist. What is one of the feminist teachings, and I know I'm going to get in trouble with all of this. I'm only doing this because I really want to get rid of these misconceptions. One of the feminist ideas is that men have a tendency to objectify women, and that there's a natural tendency in the mind of men to get distracted. Now, this, of course, has been used as an excuse very often to make women hide themselves and everything, which is not the point of all this. The point is that Sri Ramakrishna is saying that this beginning stage of spiritual life, when the mind is not turned into butter, when the mind is easily distracted, that is the nature of men to feel some attraction to women. This is not a horrible thing, but we're talking about people that Sri Ramakrishna sees as very qualified aspirants for God realization. And he sees equally that there's tremendous temptation for money and for property and wealth and name and fame and all sorts of other things. Very often he won't limit it to these two. He'll talk about the six enemies, Shadripu. So lust and greed and pride and envy and anger and all of these things together. These are all obstacles in spiritual life. But his remedy for these things, when he knows that the mind is not strong, the best thing would be to say, okay, you mix with anybody you like, but know that you're the self. Or you keep the company of women day and night, but tell yourself they're images of the Divine Mother. It doesn't work for those who haven't developed any interior spiritual life. Some desire may come in the mind, or at least desire to impress, even if it's not a lustful desire. These things come into the mind. So his point is that hedge around the small sapling. This is his point. If somebody has an addiction to alcohol, then he's saying, be a sensible person. Don't mix with people who drink. Don't go into bars. Don't go into taverns and all of that. Keep yourself a little bit free from these things because the mind has a tendency to get off track. Once you've reached this higher stage, then the danger isn't there so much. So this was his teaching to men and to women. Holy Mother was equally strong. When she's talking to the women devotees, she'll warn them also. Especially, there were a few cases where a child widow would come. Now, a child widow will have to spend, in those days, a whole life as a widow, number one. Number two, there were many men who would take advantage of them. And this was their only way out for some of them, out of a life of really extreme austerity and loneliness and sadness. So Holy Mother was very, very strong with them. If God comes to you in the form of a man, don't look at him. Huh? So strong that way. So it's a teaching that goes both ways. So this is my plea, because it hurts me very much when I think that our women devotees read this and feel bad. Please don't take it too personally and try to understand what he's trying to say with all of this. Okay, I hope I haven't got myself in trouble with all of this. Okay, so from now on, every time it says woman in gold, I will say lust in gold. Together with this, you must practice discrimination. Lust in gold is impermanent. God is the only eternal substance. What does a man get with money? And of course, every time we say man, it means person. We have to remember, this was translated in 1942, I think. And at that time, people didn't have this idea of these troublesome pronouns and things. What does a man get with money? Food, clothes, and a dwelling place, nothing more. You cannot realize God with its help. So he's setting a very, very high standard. Therefore, money can never be the goal of life. That is the process of discrimination, viveka. Discrimination, in other words, is take on a very negative connotation. Of course, we don't mean it that way. Do you understand? M. Yes, sir. I recently read a Sanskrit play called Prabodha Chandrodaya. This will be the rising of the moon of wisdom. It deals with discrimination. Here, discrimination, either vichara or viveka. These two words are used. Master. Yes, discrimination about objects. Consider, what is there in money or in a beautiful body? Now, this is another type of discrimination that goes back to the Buddha's period. It goes back to Shankaracharya. If you read his Bhaja Govindam, there's one verse also, it says exactly the same thing. That if you see the body, and of course it was all, I don't want to say sexist, but it was all male-oriented in those days, male-female oriented. If you see the body of a beautiful woman, analyze. It's made up of flesh and bones and all sorts of other things that if you saw separate, you wouldn't want to touch. Of course, I don't think it works, this discrimination. But anyhow, this was one of the paths. This is one of the things that, this is why Sri Ramakrishna will talk about distancing. Now we do this safe distancing, so that spiritual safe distancing rather than this type of discrimination. But he says this is also important. Discriminate, and you will find that even the body of a beautiful woman consists of bones, flesh, fat, and other disagreeable things. Why should a man give up God and direct his attention to such things, and vice versa? Why should a man forget God for their sake? Okay, now we'll get the next question that M will ask. Is it possible to see God? Now, we don't have to take this the seeing literally, of course. This mean, is there anything to this idea of God realization or enlightenment or nirvana, any of the things that we read about? There was an idea among many people that these things happen in the past, or to certain great souls, to these avatars or the Buddhas and Christ and Chaitanyas and everything. Do they really happen to people today? And is it even reasonable to think that we ourselves might have a chance of having that type of experience? Many people who are very, very good devotees, the highest quality devotee, if you ask them sincerely, are you striving to realize God? They'll say, how is it possible for someone like me to realize God? And many of them will say, we're householders. We read that over and over again. Sri Ramakrishna did not make that distinction. Very often he was asked, can householders also realize God? He said, yes, of course. It's not a question of what position we are in society or anything like that. It's a question of the heart, a question of the mind. Now, for a householder to realize God means also emulating this highest ideal of the sannyasi to a certain extent. Doesn't mean necessarily that you leave home and wander and become a monk, but that internal renunciation has to be there, of course. So the master says, yes, certainly. Living in solitude now and then. How many times we've had it? Half a dozen times already. Living in solitude. And remember, he gave us 3 options. You can go out into the forest. You can find a little corner of the room. Or you can just turn within. Mone, bone, koni. We have these 3 different ways of doing it. For most people, if you say, okay, that's very nice, but I have my obligations, how can I just take off and live alone someplace? He gives these other options, that even in our own home, we can practice solitude. Living in solitude now and then, repeating God's name and singing his glories, and discriminating between the real and the unreal. These are the means to employ to see him. So these are the very same answers that he gave to the earlier question. So how may we fix our minds on God? And how can we see God? It's the same thing, because we can't see God unless the mind can be fixed on God. Now, that doesn't simply mean that some intellectual training of the mind. We have to remember one important thing, that this concept of mind in the whole Indian tradition, philosophical tradition, there's even the term manas and the term chitta. We have these 2 terms, which we have the tendency to translate as mind. They mean heart as well. That distinction between mind and heart is more of a modern type of distinction, and maybe more of a Western distinction, because we think of the mind, we connect it to the brain, we think of the heart, we put it in the heart center. But really, when we talk about this purification of mind, purification of heart, they're not 2 separate things. So what we're doing is we're fixing the heart center, keeping God ever present within the heart. We're feeling that divine presence. So fixing the mind on God and realizing God, that step 1 and step 2. This we can't realize God unless we can fix the mind on God. Now, of course, in Gita, I referred to chapter 12 last time. Sri Krishna recognizes the fact that most of us cannot keep the mind fixed on God all the time, so he gives us other options. But at least we try to keep the mind on God on some level. Thakur uses this term, Sharan Monan, Smarana Manana, and especially for older people, because we reach a stage in life where we maybe can't sit for a long time in meditation, body is aching, this and that, the mind wanders a little bit. He said, okay, you don't have to worry at that stage of life about sitting and doing japa, how many thousands of times or anything. It's enough if you let the mind dwell on God. Dwelling on God, if we think that we have a very high conception of God. What do we mean by God? Oh, the infinite, supreme, absolute Brahman. How does the mind dwell on that? It is virtually impossible. What Sri Ramakrishna says over and over again is, if you think of the avatara, it's the same as thinking of God. Whether we want to identify them or not, he's saying the end result is the same. So he's always, when he's talking about remembering God, fixing the mind on God, it's with this idea that we can make that circle bigger. Think of the divine play, of the divine incarnation, or even any of the Puranic conceptions we have of God, Shiva and Durga, anything like that. So, living in solitude, now and then, repeating God's name and singing his glories, and discriminating between the real and the unreal. These are the means to employ to see him. So this is something that we may say that, is it possible for everyone to realize God? What will you say? Kumar, is it possible for everyone to realize God?
It takes a while, but yes.
It takes a while. Okay. I would say it's possible for anybody to realize God, but it's not possible for everybody to realize God. Now, what does that mean? If we have 1,000 and we're one of 1,000, you can say, why not me? It could be me. What is the song? Out of 100,000 kites, at best but one or two break free. And the mother laughs and claps her hands watching it. Huh? So it's like becoming president of the United States. We always say in this country, anybody can become president of the United States. Can everybody become president? No, we have one every 4 years or 8 years. But anybody can. So it's possible for anyone to realize God in this lifetime, but it's a rare thing. The other thing is that, what do we lose? We spend a whole lifetime trying. What have we lost? We've gained, first of all, it's a very beautiful type of life. And second of all, we don't lose anything. We'll find that life has been a perfectly fulfilling type of life. And if we don't realize God, we'll get another chance. And we'll start off from where we left off last time. So we should start out with this idea that, yes, God realization is possible. Now, God realization, or how does he put it? Is it possible to see God? This is a bit of a question of faith, that maybe we have to get rid of our logic a little bit, but we have this faith that those who come within the circle of these great souls that come from time to time, these very rare souls, Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother earlier, we always point to Chaitanya Deva and to Christ and Buddha, and then in more legendary circumstances, Rama, Krishna, and everything, that those who come within that circle, Sri Ramakrishna says, those who come to me, that those who have that devotion, that at the end of life, the end of the lifetime, the mind will get fixed on them. And that vision will come at the very end, or God realization will come at the very end, and that will be that ultimate experience. Now, what they all say, Holy Mother said it, Sri Ramakrishna said it, that yes, Holy Mother would say, yes, my child, that Thakur will come, you'll have God realization at the end of life, have that faith. But if you want to realize here and now, you have to work very hard. You have to do all of your spiritual practices and spiritual disciplines. I read an interesting thing recently. One of our monks was talking to one of the very senior swamis, one of the kind of second generation swamis, who was living in our ashram in Kashi, in Benares. And he was asking him, do you believe that whoever dies in Benares will get liberation? So this monk said, you young fellow, I come here with that faith, and you question that? You want me to answer that type of question? So I can divulge it. Swami Atmajnanananda, he was very good. He was young at the time, of course. And he said, no, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean it to question your faith, but I want to know, because we hear, Thakur says and others say, that if one has the slightest desire, and if one hasn't purified the heart, one has to come back again. So this monk, he smiled and he said, yes, both are true. He says what happens is at the very end that Shiva himself will come, whisper the mantra in your ear, and remove all your desires. So both are true. That anyone who dies here will get liberation, but it only happens if one becomes free from desires. Both are true. He said it that way. So anyhow, the point is that we can have that faith that illumination will come at the very final moment if the whole life is geared to that. That's also not a simple thing. If we're harboring worldly desires the whole time, then that's what will come to the mind at the end. But if we really have that faith and devotion and love, that will come to the top. That will be the cream that rises to the top at the very end. And that final thought is what determines what happens after death. But we should also have that faith that we can realize God here and now. I remember I had a conversation once with Swami Atmajnanananda. He is still, I shouldn't say, he's kind of retired from, he was a trustee and retired from that, and acharya and everything, leading a very quiet life. But he was a very, very, in his youth, and still very austere and very indrawn and very deep thinker. And I remember he asked me once, do you have firm faith that you'll realize God in this very lifetime? And I didn't know what to say. I think that if I were a betting man, the odds would be a long shot. But still, his point was that we should have a little bit of optimism that it's possible, that it can happen at any moment, that this is why we don't give up our spiritual practice, because we don't know. We don't know what morning that we overslept would have been the morning that we would have had some experience in meditation. We don't know. We have to assume every time we sit for meditation, every time we sit for our spiritual practice, that might be the time when something will open up. Maybe not as an ultimate experience, but something will open up, some glimpse will come, something will happen. That we have to have that much faith that grace is always there, and at any time it may swoop down, that breeze may catch us. We may just be raising our sail at the right time when the wind is there, and some experience may happen. So this is otherwise, why would Sri Ramakrishna say that God realization is the ultimate goal of life? Uddeshya. He would say that this is the goal of life for everyone. The end of life, the goal of life. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that everyone has that as their active goal in life. Most people will say no. My goal in life is I want to have raise a good family. I want to have a good career. I want to have enjoyments. I have different goals with regard to my work that I do. Charitable work could be all good things. It can be bad things. I want to be the wealthiest person in the world. I want to have the most possessions. But is my goal in life God realization? No. So Sri Ramakrishna doesn't mean that. He means that this is the ultimate end, that will go on and on and on until we have that. That life is geared for that, whether we realize it or not. That we come into this world with a lot of ignorance and with a lot of dust that we have to shake off, and that for whatever reason, I'm not going to say it was planned this way or anything, but for whatever reason, that this seems to be the scheme of things, so that everyone will end this particular journey with God realization. That's how it means this uddeshya is God realization. So M. Now his next question will assume that he is unquestionably accepting Sri Ramakrishna's answer. That when he says, yes, certainly, so that's enough for M. So now M is thinking, well, I know that it's absolutely possible to have God realization. How can I do it? So the next question, under what conditions does one see God? Master, cry to the Lord with an intensely yearning heart, and you will certainly see him. People shed a whole jug of tears for wife and children. They swim in tears for money. But who weeps for God? Cry to him with a real cry. We'll stop here because this is a very, very, I don't want to simply say important answer. This is the most important answer. If we want to really pinpoint one teaching of Sri Ramakrishna that is the most important, so much so that some people say that this was the yoga that he taught, the Vyakulata yoga, that this longing and yearning for God is the ultimate, final, conclusive, primary cause of God realization. The jnani will say that all karma yoga, everything is secondary, knowledge is primary. The devotee will say everything is secondary, love is the one thing. Sri Ramakrishna said everything is not secondary, but dependent upon this tremendous longing of the heart for God realization. So we'll stop here and continue with that spot next time. Now we'll close with our closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityamanandarupam Bhaktanukam Bhaturavikraham Ishapataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namaha. We bow our heads before Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, of infinite nature, whose heart melts in sympathy for his devotees, who is an embodiment of the divine and the Supreme Lord, and ever worthy of our worship. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto us.